Well, welcome to C-Files, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm taking a break from all the studying I've been doing, which makes my brain feel like it's been in a CrossFit competition and a pro football game at the same time, all beat up. My brain is tired. Anyway, so we've been going through logic and faith, the logical, or excuse me, illogical arguments that are made by evolutionary arguments made by evolutionists, Darwinian evolutionists. And so we're going to be in three, the fallacy let's go over here, the fallacy of begging the question. So we're going to go through that today. Um, and then I'm going to go back to my study. Now, we've got one coming up that I think is going to pique a lot of people's interest. And that is this book, Woke Injustice, A Biblical Response to Critical Race Theory. I'm going to read this book on the channel. As I go along, and I have not read this book yet, so I will read it on the channel, and you'll get my genuine reaction to what it has to say. But basically, it explains what critical race theory is. It talks about, whiteness, white infragility, white, the white, um, what's it? I can't think of the word. Superiority. What's it called? Mm, let's see. Equity is chapter 13. Anti-racism, whiteness, white privilege. That's the one I was trying to think of. White supremacy is one I was trying to think of also. White fragility. I mean, it goes through all of that and explains it, and then it gives a biblical response to all of that. So when it comes to the Christian and the church, how are we to respond and to critical race theory? Should we accept it? Should we reject it? How can we think of it in a critical thinking way, a logical way, a biblical way of addressing it? Well, we're going to look at that in this book. Now, got to get through this one first, though. So we're going to do today the fallacy of begging the question. So let's go ahead and get right into it. He writes on page 17, I once told a telescope session with a small group of people, including a 4-year-old boy who was particularly interested in astronomy. I asked this young budding astronomer if he believed in alien spaceships. Of course, he said. I then asked him why he believed in alien spaceships. I'll never forget his clever response. How else would the aliens get here? Pretty logical, isn't it? The aliens would never be able to get to Earth without a spaceship. So clearly, there must be alien spaceships. This is a wonderful example of a very common error in reasoning, the fallacy of begging the question. This fallacy is committed when a person merely assumes what he or she is attempting to prove, or when the premise of an argument actually depends on its conclusion. In this case, our young student was attempting to prove the existence of alien spacecraft by taking it for granted that aliens have traveled to Earth. But that is essentially the point in the question, right? This young aspiring astronomer was reasoning in a circle. Of course, we expect such humorous reasoning from a 4-year-old. As we grow up, we expect to become rational and not make these kinds of logical mistakes. That's why it's so disturbing to find that many adults commit the fallacy of begging the question in debates on origins. Some examples are obvious. Evolution must be true because it is a fact. But more commonly, the fallacy is much more subtle. Consider some of the following arguments, and then now he's going to go through some arguments. Argument number one. The Bible cannot be true because it contains miracles, and miracles would violate the laws of nature. How many times have you heard this argument? Here's the response. Yes, miracles can potentially involve a temporary suspension of the laws of nature, not that all of them necessarily do, since the Bible makes it clear. that God is beyond natural laws, he can suspend, violate them if he wishes to. But the critic's argument has simply taken it for granted that violations of laws of nature are impossible. In other words, the arguer has already assumed that the Bible is false to argue that the Bible is false. He has begged the question. Now, what else would he be assuming, folks, in this one that's not here in the writing? He's assuming that God doesn't exist. So, now here's the second one. The Bible cannot be true because it teaches that the earth is only thousands of years old, whereas we know earth is billions of years old. I was taught the earth was billions of years old from the time I was in elementary school up. The whole evolutionary um, religion was taught to me all the way through high school. And of course, when you get into college, they still push it. Well, here's the response to that argument. All such arguments commit the fallacy of begging the question. Here's why old earth arguments are all based on assumptions of naturalism, which is nature is all that there is. Naturalism believes that there's only nature and nothing else. And a large degree of uniformitarianism, which is basically present rates and processes are representative of past rates and processes. For example, the decay of carbon-14 remains the same throughout history. It never varies. It never changes. It's always the same rate that we observe today. It was the same in the past. That's an assumption that's made by evolutionists. Now, then by extrapolating from present rates of various Earth processes, the person estimates how long it would take to build up or erode certain geological features, or how long it would take for a radioisotope to decay. So based upon the assumption that the rate of decay is constant, that it never varies, using that assumption of constant rate of decay, they calculate, how many years back it would go and so forth. But the Bible denies naturalism and uniformitarianism. For example, erosion rates during the global flood would be very quick, right? If it's a global flood. By assuming naturalism and uniformitarianism, the critic has already merely assumed that the Bible's wrong. He hasn't proven that the Bible's wrong, he just assumes it. He then uses this assumption to conclude that the Bible's wrong. His reasoning is circular. So you've heard of circular reasoning. So here's the next one, the next argument. Creation cannot be true because you would have to ignore all that scientific evidence. Here's the response. But this argument begs the question because it presupposes that scientific evidence somehow provides support for evolution. And if you've ever been to the Creation Museum in Kentucky or the Ark, they have a lot of scientific argumentation on the other side. But they're saying here that this idea that scientific evidence somehow proves support for evolution has never been demonstrated. Here's the next argument. It makes no sense to deny evolution. It is a well-established fact of nature. Now, this argument, it begs the question, since the truth status of evolution is the very question at issue. Christians are not always above circular reasoning either. So here's one on the Christian side. The Bible must be the Word of God because it says it is, and what it says must be true since God cannot lie. Of course, it is quite true that the Bible does claim to be the Word of God. Now, it's called a truth claim. And it is also true that God does not lie. But when one of these statements is used as the sole support for the other, the argument commits the fallacy of begging the question. The same line of argumentation could be used to prove the Quran, which of course we would deny. Now it's time to get a little philosophically deep. Brace yourself. Begging the question is a very strange fallacy because it is actually valid. Recall that a valid argument is one in which the conclusion does follow from the premises. Normally, fallacies are not valid, but normally fallacies are not valid. The fact that their conclusion does not follow the premises is what makes them fallacies. So you have premises and then you have a conclusion. If the conclusion does not follow the premises, then the syllogism or the argumentation is not valid. It doesn't mean that if it's valid that it's necessarily true. It just means that the conclusion logically follows from the premises. What you have to do is be able to prove that the premises are true. And so usually when an argument is attacked, it would be attacked based upon the premises. If you've ever heard anyone say, I disagree with that premise, and they proceed to try and prove that the premise is false, that's how you argue against a syllogism. So, which a syllogism is simply just conclusions coming to, I meant to say premises coming to a conclusion in an argument. So that's a syllogism. Anyway, going back to the book, he says, I'll read it again. Normally, fallacies are not valid. Um, the fact that their conclusion does not follow from the premises is what makes them fallacies. But oddly, with begging the question, the conclusion does not, I'm sorry, but oddly, begging the question, the conclusion does follow from the premise because it is simply a restatement of the premise. So the argument, evolution must be true because it is true, is a fact, is valid. It, you're restating the premise and the conclusion, so logically it follows the premise. But if it is valid, then why is it considered a fallacy? The answer would seem to be that begging the question is a fallacy because it is arbitrary. Circular arguments of this kind are not useful because anyone who denies the conclusion would also deny the premise, since the conclusion is essentially the same as the premise. So if you're attacking the premise and the conclusion is the same as the premise, then you're also attacking the conclusion. So the argument, evolution must be true because it's a fact, while technically valid, is fallacious because the arguer has merely assumed what he is trying to prove. It's like when you're doing a definition, you don't want to put the word that you're trying to define in the definition because now you're just restating the word, you're not giving a definition. All right. Arbitrary assumptions are not to be used in logical reasoning because we could equally well assume the exact opposite. It would be just as legitimate to argue evolution cannot be true because it is false. So you're trying to make a truth statement, a truth claim. Now you have to be able to show that the truth claim is actually true. It should also be noted that there are certain special cases where circular reasoning is unavoidable and not necessarily fallacious. Remember that begging the question is not invalid. It is considered fallacious because it is arbitrary. But what if it were not arbitrary? There are some situations where the conclusion of an argument must be assumed at the outset, but it is not arbitrary. Here's an example. Premise one, without laws of logic, we could not make an argument. Premise two, we can make an argument. Conclusion, therefore, there must be laws of logic. Now, this argument is perfectly reasonable and valid, but it is subtly circular. This argument is using a law of logic called modus tollens to prove that there are laws of logic. So we have tacitly assumed what we are trying to prove. But it is absolutely unavoidable in this case. We must use laws of logic to prove anything, even the existence of laws of logic. However, the above argument is not arbitrary. We do have a good reason for assuming laws of logic, since without them, we couldn't prove anything. And perhaps most significantly, anyone attempting to disprove the existence of laws of logic would have to first assume that laws of logic do exist in order to make the argument. He would refute himself. You understand what he's saying? He's saying, well, okay, I'm going to try to argue that laws of logic don't actually exist. But in order to do that, I have to use logical argumentation to prove that logic doesn't exist. I'm refuting myself. Most of the examples of circular reasoning used by evolutionists are of the fallacious begging the question variety. They are arbitrary. Consider the evolutionist who argues this. The Bible cannot be correct because it says that stars were created in a single day, but we know that it takes millions of years for stars to form. Here's the response. By assuming that stars form over millions of years, the critic has taken for granted that they were not supernaturally created. He has tacitly assumed the Bible is wrong in his attempt to argue that the Bible is wrong. He has begged the question. Do you see what he's doing there? So, by the way, how did the light get all the way from the stars to the earth in that short a period of time? God can accelerate the rate of light to whatever speed he chooses if he's the creator. And he could take it from a star that now, at the current rate of speed, is light years away, however many light years away, and he could have done it instantaneously. If God, by definition, is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, um, he's all knowing, he's all powerful, he's everywhere at the same time, it would be no problem for him. Now, here's another example. We know evolution must have happened because we are here. In other words, if evolution didn't occur, then we wouldn't be here. This is the assumption that only evolution can put us here. This argument begs the question, since the way we got here is the very point of the question. Watch for arguments that suddenly presume, in an arbitrary way, what the critic is attempting to prove. In particular, evolutionists will often take for granted the assumptions of naturalism, uniformitarianism, strict empiricism, which is the notion that all truth claims are answered by observation and experimentation, and sometimes evolution itself. But these are the very claims at issue. When an evolutionist takes these things for granted, he is not giving a good logical reason for his position. He is simply arbitrarily asserting his position. Now, in case you think that, or you may conclude that some high school student doing a thesis wrote this, um, I will read you who the author is. Dr. Jason Lissel is a Christian astrophysicist who researches issues pertaining to science and the Christian faith. Lissel earned a PhD in astrophysics at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Dr. Lissel has worked at Answers in Genesis and Institutes of Creation Research and is the founder of the Biblical Science Institute. So he's well qualified to write this book and to make these observations when it comes to these logical arguments. So there you go. All right. Current events. I know there's a ton of stuff happening on current events. This is already getting long. What is it? It's almost 20 minutes just to go through that. Uh, Tomorrow, I will be doing the podcast, the Vortex Apologetic podcast with my partner, and we will be talking about current events, and I will record it, hopefully successfully, to be able to put it on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch that. So if you're interested in current events, that'll be where you can get that. I will do individual videos on that when I have an opportunity, but right now I got to get back to my studies. And don't forget that this is coming up. And I will announce this the last chapter in this book that I'm doing now, I will announce that I'll be going into this one. And this should be a fun book. It's not that heavy of a read, but it should be very educational. So, and quite controversial, I'm sure. Anyway, God bless. Thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying this content. If not, then go watch or do whatever you enjoy. But if you do enjoy it, please like and subscribe. And I don't advertise. I don't monetize. I do this because I want to be a benefit to others, and I want to glorify God. And that's why I do these videos. Thanks for watching. God bless. I'll see you next time here on the C Files.